Whereas in 10 years ago we could all take for granted we are liberal societies, we can't do that anymore because of the threats to liberal free speech. We can't make the deeply felt passions and grievances of people the measure of the extent of free speech, otherwise we lose it. But I certainly think that the very unbalanced denigration of Britain's colonial past is a threat to national self-confidence, actually. I rejoice in the fact that we have recently had an ethnically Indian Hindu Prime Minister. I rejoice in the fact that we now have a first-generation black Nigerian woman as leader of the Conservative opposition. In some ways, that is a realization of the liberal ideal of the empire. The simple equation, empire equals evil, is not tenable. I also think that actually they don't want other people to hear what I have to say because some of what I have to say is true.
Hello and welcome to Tell Me More, the English-speaking talk of Germany's Die Zeit. My guest today is Lord Biggar, Emeritus of Moral Theology at Oxford University, and Lord Biggar, as your title tells, a member of the House of Lords. Welcome and thanks for making the time.
Thanks, Jochen. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Brilliant. Nigel Biggar, you are more known here in Britain for a recent book you wrote on colonialism. It's called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. And it is interesting in many respects, but it's interesting also because your original publisher actually didn't publish it. And
That's
for
right.
some reason, and I guess that has to do with the main thesis of the book, and I'd like to quote it, which is, if colonial history gives those of us who identify ourselves with Britain cause for lament and shame, it also gives us cause for admiration and pride. Now, I guess that's something very provocative and controversial to say these days, that colonialism had its positives. So please tell us, Nigel, why you felt the urge to write this book anyway, and what happened afterwards.
So, Jochen, the reason I chose to write the book was political. In spite of my accent, I'm in fact Scottish. And so 11 years ago, when there was a referendum in Scotland on whether Scotland should become independent, although I'm a natural Anglo-Scottish unionist, I felt obliged to look at what nationalist separatists were saying. And one argument I came across can be distilled into this equation. Britain equals empire equals evil, therefore the Scotch should leave the United Kingdom and sail off into a bright new shiny sin-free, probably European future. But having read British imperial history for about 20 years, I knew the simple equation, empire equals evil, is not tenable. So for example, nowadays it's really common to use the phrase colonialism and slavery as if they were the same thing, to which my response is, well, yes, for 150 years, from 1650 to 1807, 1833, yes, they were closely identified, but from the early 1800s till the end of the life of the British Empire was among the first states in the history of the world to abolish both slave trading and slavery, and then spent the second half of its life suppressing slavery from Brazil to New Zealand. So you can't identify empire with evil, British Empire with slavery. It was both. So that's why my thesis was what I thought to be the completely balanced and incontrovertible position that we British can find cause for both pride and shame and pride in the past.
And you just started with the, I guess, most horrific part of British colonial history, which was slavery.
Yes.
Could you try and talk us through let's say, the worst negatives and the biggest positives of colonialism? I mean, the slave trade was very well documented in a way. We know a lot about it.
Yep.
I think we know less about what you describe in your book as the positives of colonialism. So can you give us, or try to give us a bit of a balance, how you see it?
Yeah, so just for the sake of your listeners and viewers, on page 276 you will find in my book a list of all the bad stuff. So those who say that my book whitewashes the history of the British Empire are wrong. There's a long list of bad things. But on the other side, there's a list of good things. So among the bad things that the British Empire presided over, and by the way, we're talking about a political organisation that lasted 400 years. So when I talk about the bad stuff, I challenge anyone to find me any state that lasted 400 years that did not preside over some very bad stuff. But among the things would be, yes, 150 years worth of slave trading and slavery that some Britons were involved in. I don't think the British state as such was involved in, but certainly some private investors and traders were involved in that. Then probably the most devastating impact of European and British colonisation in North America and Australia was the importation of disease. So Europeans were accustomed to domesticated animals. We'd become immune to the diseases that animals spread, but Native Americans and Aboriginals in Australia were not. And so the impact of the importation of disease was devastating. According to one American historian, if a Native American people succumbed to successive epidemics of disease over a 50-year period in the 1700s, they would lose 90% of the population. So that was devastating, but it wasn't intentional. It was tragic, not atrocious.
I would guess that many people would say that one of the biggest negatives of colonialism was not only the importation of disease, but also the importation of a certain worldview, namely that you regarded other races as inferior. So that's a common accusation, of course, towards the British Empire, that it was based on racism. How would you respond to that?
I would say that in the British Empire there was both racism and anti-racism. Yes, you have slavery for 150 years based on the assumption that Africans are natural slaves and don't deserve the same treatment as Europeans. That was racist, it was abhorrent. But then you have the anti-slavery movement premised on the largely Christian assumption that all human beings are equal under God regardless of race. So you've got these vying views in the empire. Same thing I'd say about superiority and inferiority, Jochen, and this is controversial, but I do believe it. Notwithstanding basic human equality of all people regardless of race, I do think cultures are not always equal. So a culture that's figured out that the world the earth is round, not flat, or that the earth goes around the sun, not the sun around the earth, is scientifically superior to one that hasn't. A culture that has figured out that slavery is bad is morally superior to one that hasn't. So in some respects, in 1900, let's say, when the British Empire was at its height, when Britons felt superior to other cultures, in certain respects, they were right.
No question about this. The question, though, may be how this would translate to the people that they dealt with. I mean, if you feel culturally superior, you may be justified in feeling culturally superior, but that may have an impact on the people that you deal with, which amounts to racism, basically.
So yes, in many cases that would produce a racial arrogance that would humiliate non-white peoples. But I say two things about that. At the same time, there was also a humanitarian liberal strand within the empire, so that black Africans in Cape Colony were granted the vote on the same terms as whites in 1853, Maori males in New Zealand, 1867, Native Canadians in Canada, 1885. So
that was well before the vote was given to a comparable group in Britain itself, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, men and women in Britain didn't receive the vote in equal terms until 1928. But in each of those cases, there was an assumption that native peoples would be integrated into society on equal terms.
Right.
So yes, there was sometimes abhorrent racism, but there was also a strong and sustained liberal tradition as well.
Let us come back to slavery for one more minute, because I think that's an important point to raise. When I read your book, I got a bit angry with my history teachers, to be honest, because I realized what I didn't know about slavery in a global sense. Because what you make clear in your book is that there has always been slavery from the beginning of time, more or less.
Yes.
And it wasn't only the European empires that engaged in slavery. It was of course the Africans too. North African pirates actually raided European coastal towns from the 16th century onwards and brought, well, one estimate has it about 1 million slaves to the Ottoman states in for the Ottoman market through North Africa. I have to confess, I didn't know about this.
No.
And I guess that is due to the fact that criticism towards empires and colonialism is very much limited to Western empires and colonialism and not to other forms of empires and colonialism.
No, and that, you're quite right, and that bears some thinking about as to why this focus on European empires. And part of the problem with a lot of current discourse about these things is taking the European or the British case out of context. So in the case of slavery, yes, I mean slavery and slave trading were practiced since the dawn of time on every continent by people of every skin color. When I was in Canada in March and learning about the native peoples on the Pacific Northwest coast, all of their societies were built on slaves. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they depended on fish to survive. Fish required processing. You have to process it quickly if it's not going to go rotten. The quantity of fish required to sustain the societies far outstripped the amount of female labour required to process them. They needed to raid and catch slaves so they could process their fish. Mm-hmm. All of the societies were built on slaves. The Comanche in the 1700s ran what one historian in Oxford has called a vast slave economy in the 1700s. Slavery was universal. So, although the slavery practiced in the West Indies and in the American colonies was among the worst, it wasn't uniquely bad, but it was among the worst, it remains true that slavery was not uniquely British at all, or European.
Now, critics might say that by highlighting all this, you might try to downplay what the West has done, what the British have committed. But reading your book, you clearly don't. So you're not diminishing any of the atrocities that happened during the British Empire. So why was it that your book wasn't published in the first place? It then, we have to say, became a bestseller when a different publisher took it on. But so let's jump back to when you tried to publish it. What happened?
Let me just go back even further. So in April 2018, I was approached by Bloomsbury Publishing and asked to write a book on with the working title of An Intelligent Person's Guide to Colonialism. And I agreed, I signed a contract, and on the 31st of December 2020, I produced the manuscript. I sent it off to my publishing editor just before the deadline fell at midnight. And then in early 2021, my commissioning editor wrote to me to say that he was speechless with admiration for the book's comprehensiveness and rigour. He said it was one of the most important books to come across his desk in some years, and he predicted sales of up to 20,000 copies. It then went into the copy editing process. They produced a cover. This was between January and March, but in March I got an email from the top of Bloomsbury announcing that they were postponing publication indefinitely because, quote, public feeling is unfavourable. I can talk at great length about this, so often I shan't, but I simply say that a reliable source within Bloomsbury reported to me what had happened was that junior staff had protested about having to work on material they regarded as offensive, and the management caved in.
Okay, but then you found another publisher. What happened then?
There was yes, the story has a happy ending. So in August 2021, HarperCollins came through and offered me another contract, and the book was published in March 23. As you said, within a week it entered the bestsellers list of the Sunday Times newspaper, and since then it has sold not 20,000 copies but 65,000 copies.
Oh, okay.
So happy ending.
Yeah. I mean, if you read other books on colonialism, namely by the rather left-wing historian William Dalrymple, you partly find similar analysis as to why the British Empire managed to be so successful across the world. And let me just quote one sentence from William Dalrymple's book on the East India Company called Anarchy. And he also states, and I quote, that the companies, so the East India Company's ever-growing empire, could not have been achieved without the political support of regional power groups and local communities. And what he describes in the book is that the British involvement in India had, of course, upsides for the Indians themselves, and so they, many of them, actually supported the British engagement in India. Why was that?
Oh, I think for a variety of reasons. So just to make clear what you're implying, Jochen, is correct. It's wrong to think that empire is always simply imposed. There may be an element of, or moments of force, but there's also many elements of collaboration or cooperation that people engage in for a variety of interests. Why did Indian people cooperate with the East India Company? Partly for trade. I mean, the East India Company was there primarily to trade. The East India Company also provided Indian princes with armed force, and although the company had no interest in fighting civil wars in India, war is bad for trade. One Indian prince is fighting another one, and asks the company for aid. The company gives aid, wins the battle. Indian prince rewards the company with ports and land and whatever.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's an interesting figure in your book which illustrates why the British maybe didn't need suppressive power or so much suppressive power to rule India. And I think the figure is that 40,000 soldiers were enough to control a continent of 300 million inhabitants back then. Well, maybe not even to control it, but to just make sure that the British had the upper hand in case of conflict.
So yes, I forget the figure about soldiers, but in 1900 there were 300 million Indians and a total of 164,000 Britons, including military. Now, yes, the effectiveness of British military force was a factor in that, but also, in addition to elites having certain benefits, sometimes the British built canal systems, sometimes they built railways, sometimes they built railways in order to relieve famine, and of course the building of infrastructure helped trade to flourish. So the empire did bring benefits to Indians. I mean, most Indians for most of history were used to being ruled by other people. So the fact that there were white Britons in charge was no different. But sometimes the white Britons, in collaboration with Indians, did bring benefits to Indian people.
You mentioned infrastructure. One could also mention rule of law.
Yes.
Education.
Yes, and even though the British government in London and colonial governments until after the Second World War tended not to be directly involved in investment, in infrastructure or whatever, because governments tend to be preoccupied with things like law and order and defence. The fact that colonial governments provided a measure of security and stability meant that British investors until the 1930 or so were the largest international investors in the world. British investors were willing to invest money in India and Australia and elsewhere. And it was through a combination of government conditions and private investment that railways were built in India.
But Nigel, was there a difference between, let's say, the colonial officers here in London, or maybe even in India, and the British colonialists, the settlers on the ground, in that there might have been this idea of trying to alleviate the Indians out of poverty on the side of the officials. But I guess the Indians were also brutalized by settlers on the ground. So maybe you had both, you know, anti-racism and racism very much taking effect in India.
Yes, I think that's generally right, Jochen. Anti-African or Indian prejudice. There weren't many settlers in India, but in Africa, anti-African prejudice on the part of settlers was widespread. On the part of planters and sometimes traders in India, it was also widespread. So there's a contrast between the attitudes of colonial officials and missionaries, who were often humanitarian and liberal, and business people and planters. That's true.
Right. Let's jump now to this interesting fact that you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, namely that it was the younger staff at Bloomsbury who protested against your book.
Yes.
I guess that was pretty much the motivation for you to write this book in the first place. So what was your reaction back then when you heard that it was prevented from publishing by people who didn't actually want to hear the facts or read about colonial history in the first place?
To be precise, in this case as in others, in all cases of cancellation, the issue is not whether those doing the cancelling are compelled to read or hear, because they're not. they don't have to listen to me or read me at all. What's at issue is whether they should be allowed to stop me being heard by other people or read by other people. My mission...
Sure, but maybe they wanted to stop you because they misrepresented or misjudged what you were about to say in your book.
Not having listened to me, they invariably do. I also think that actually they don't want other people to hear what I have to say because some of what I have to say is true. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think it. As for my reaction, Jochen, my immediate reaction when Bloomsbury cancelled my book was I was really depressed because I thought, have we come to a place in Britain where what someone like me has to say on a publicly important topic that my commissioning editor regards as important and impressive cannot be published because junior staff persuade or intimidate senior management into cancelling it. Is that what we've come to? And that, apart from the personal frustration, the concern that we in Britain have come to that place really did depress me.
And that speaks to a deeper point that I would like to inquire you about, because you also state this in your book, that you believe that the actual reason behind the fact that it's only Western empires that get attacked and criticized is that the real attack is for the West, the Western concept of liberalism. And you write that the real target of today's anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist is the West, or more precisely, the Anglo-American world order.
Yes.
Now, that's a stark comment. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, the reason I come to that conclusion goes back to an earlier remark that we made, namely that it is remarkable that the focus is on European, and in particular British Empire, when empire has been a universal form of organisation, and indeed arguably China still does empire in Tibet, would do empire in Taiwan, has done empire in Hong Kong. So why the focus on European empires? And I think, and why such an unbalanced focus? Because as I say, I don't deny that the West has done bad things. I just think it's also done some liberal humanitarian things. But the critics of empire, the decolonizers, the anti-colonialists in the West, their view is so unbalanced. So I think this is an expression of a long tradition of left-wing criticism of the West as such. So the British Empire is a kind of proxy for the West.
On the other hand, one might say, self-doubt has always been a strength of the West. So the ability to scrutinize yourself and to highlight your mistake makes is the prerequisite to improve yourself.
Yes.
As a person, as a state, as a culture. So, but would you say that self-criticism has been overblown into self-flagellation rather, that then tends to make a culture and a nation weak rather than stronger.
Yes, on other occasions I've said that my target here is the suicidal self-loathing of certain parts of the left for the West. So yeah, absolutely, self-doubt and self-criticism is important, and it's healthy because that means we can correct ourselves. And in my book I am not uncritical of the West, and all of us can find things about the West to be critical of. But we need balance, because partly out of loyalty or fidelity to the truth about the past. Our ancestors did achieve some really important things. We like the movement against slavery, like the development of liberal institutions, like the fight against fascism. We ought to admire those and resolve to promote similar things in the future. So it's a matter of a balanced take about the past. But I certainly think that the very unbalanced denigration of Britain's colonial past is a threat to national self-confidence, actually. And not just Britain, but Australia and Canada as well.
Right. I have to say, I tried and looked for a bit of empirical evidence to what you've just described. So the other day I went up to a public library in Brent, which is a neighborhood in London, a borough which is heavily comprised of immigrants. I think 50% of the population there are immigrants, mostly from Muslim countries. And so I went into this public library, which was very well frequented actually by young people doing their homework. And the first thing that you encounter when you enter the library are tables with displays of books on colonialism. And actually, as you say, the selection was very one-sided. I'd just like to give you a couple of titles that immediately spring to the eye when you enter the library. They were, for instance, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. Another title read, A Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire, or Violence, Colonialism and the Empire in the Modern World, or Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. I could go on.
Yes.
And then I asked staff for your book if they had this somewhere too. I mean, it wasn't on display, but the answer was, no, they didn't have this, wasn't available in the library. And I mean, I guess that all of these books, they are pretty well worth reading. But as you said, I didn't really find a balanced selection of books. And so if this is the way to inform a generation of, I guess, second or third generation of immigrants to Britain, I'm a bit worried about the picture of history that they get for their country.
No, I too, and because if it's true that Britain's history is simply a litany of racism, exploitation, and oppression, why would you want to come here? I mean, what is there of worth here? Because all our institutions are implicated. So I do worry about it, especially at a time. I mean, I guess 10, 20 years ago, when we thought the Cold War was over and liberal democracy had won, one could afford to be perhaps relaxed about national loyalty and identity. Now I think that's no longer the case, given the threat to liberal democracy from Russia and from China. We need to be a little more self-conscious about valuing what the past has given us.
Right. That's an interesting point, because I mean, other nations and cultures, you just mentioned some, they are very confident. And I would even say that they have a kind of, or display a kind of civilizational pride.
Yes.
Let's just name Russia, China.
Yeah.
One could also mention Islam as a culture, as a religion. Very aspirational as a culture.
Yes.
So, I mean, there are good historical reasons for Westerners to shy away from civilizational pride. But given the partly aggressive aspirations that we see in other parts of the world, how should we? What would you wish for as a kind of balance? You know, that might incorporate a decent amount of self-criticism,
Yes.
but also a decent amount of self-confidence.
The point is that self-criticism needs to be discriminate. And we can certainly be critical of European involvement in slavery, but let's put it in context. And the context is slavery was universal, and countries in Northwest Europe were among the first countries in the history of the world to abolish both. So let's lament slavery, let's admire those who came to the view that slavery is abhorrent. And it's not hard to do, because if you tell the whole truth, you know, history is a mixed bag. And what's really disturbing about the current climate is that the library in Brent tells only one half, and a very unbalanced half of the story, and is not open. It's not open to the other half, because to suggest that there might be something admirable about British colonialism and empire is to be racist, and therefore why would you want to read Biggar because he's racist? Now that's ignorant, and it's actually a form of prejudice of its own. But we really need to break that open and have a proper liberal discussion that wants to get at the whole truth, not just politically partisan bits of it.
I wonder if we might be running into an even bigger problem here, in that when you look at surveys, especially among young people in Britain, you would find that very many of them would say they don't even know what to defend about this country.
No.
Whereas in China and also in Russia, I guess you don't have this problem. And I just like to quote some of the figures that I found recently. Almost half of young people in Britain, so that is between the age of 18 and 24, believe that Britain was founded on racism and continues to be structurally racist today. And 38% agree that removing Winston Churchill's statue from Parliament Square would be justified because he held racist views. Now, at the same time, if you contrast this with what is happening in Russia, for instance, I found that and Russia, in fact, is a colonial power today.
Yes.
I found that in Russia, nearly half of young people in the same age group hold a positive attitude towards Joseph Stalin.
Yeah.
And far from removing any statues of him, a couple of weeks ago, a new monument of Joseph Stalin was unveiled in the Moscow metro. So, I mean, that shows how, if self-perception defines self-confidence,
yes,
the West really has a problem, obviously.
No, so this just confirms my point about the political importance of this. And I think, yes, if young Britons grow up with this view, it certainly does weaken us in terms of our response to threats from outside, which is why it's really important that we have an open, proper discussion about these matters, because the kind of views you're reporting there are really ignorant in terms of Churchill and racism, in terms of racism in this country. I mean, if you look at World Values Survey 2023, in terms of which asks questions of people in 17 countries about whether they would object to having as a neighbour an immigrant or someone of a different race, Britain is among the lowest in the world, not much above Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Germany. Russia, China, Iran, among the highest. So actually, Britain, certainly in the last 50 years, has made major progress in terms of dealing with race relations. So these views widely held by youngsters are just not true. And it's really distressing that media, and the BBC is to be blamed to some extent for this, is not doing more work in correcting the balance.
I mean, you wouldn't agree with the assumption that Churchill held racist views? Just illuminate us on this.
Well, Churchill, yes, I mean, he made disparaging remarks about Mahatma Gandhi, which were arguably racist. On the other hand, early in his
I think he called him a half-naked fakir, or what was the...
Yeah, well, that was insulting, and it was prejudice. But although Churchill, that was in a moment of deep frustration during negotiations, so he said those things. On the other hand, I think subsequently he welcomed Gandhi, and also before then, Churchill was, I think when he was colonial secretary in the 1920s, he went out to Africa, to East Africa, and was extremely critical of British settlers there, and was determined that British settlers should not come to dominate the government of East Africa. And it was around that time that the Colonial Office issued the statement that in future the government of Britain's African colonies should regard as paramount the interests of Africans. So to dismiss Churchill as a racist, and I guess the other thing too is, I mean, without Churchill, the British Empire would not have offered the genocidally racist regime in Nazi Berlin the only military opposition between May 1940 and June 41.
Sure.
So let's see
Thanks
see
for
things
that,
in
by
the
the
right. Yes, I'm sorry. not German Nazi.
Point taken. But let us talk about what maybe a certain lack of self-confidence means in today's environment, in today's politics. I was, to be honest, struck by a court ruling just recently here in Britain. A man was charged for burning a Quran in the streets of London on the grounds that he had insulted Islam. Now, some people say that this is basically the reintroduction of blasphemy laws into British society. Now, I can understand the judge in a certain way in that he wants to prevent other people from burning Qurans in the streets of Britain, given what anger this might start with the Muslim community. On the other hand, doing away with first principles of free speech might be a kind of appeasement towards a certain group of immigrants who feel that their idea of values should be more considered in British society. So the conflict here might be that either you stick to your free speech principles or you cause community tensions. How would you square this circle?
No, that's a difficult one. So in this case, someone was burning a Quran in public. So this was a public act. I can't remember the context, but it may well be the context was such that this was a deliberately provocative act.
Well, certainly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But he placed himself. We have to say that because that's important. It's different if you stand in front of a mosque, for instance, or not. And he was standing in front of the Turkish consulates because he wanted to protest against Erdogan, the Erdogan regime.
Okay.
But he also screamed about how bad he thought Islam is as a religion. Yeah. So this had this clearly religious component to it.
So you got a similar case where during the pro-Palestinian protests in London, you had a Jewish person, maybe wearing a kippah, so he was identifiable, who came into contact with the marchers, and the police told the Jewish person to remove himself because he was being provocative, because his presence was. My view is that was wrong. That's to say, protesters in this country have the right to protest, and if you believe certain views of Palestine, you should have the right to protest. But protesters also have a duty to restrain themselves in the face of people or views they don't like. And it was wrong of the police to in effect say that anyone who might upset the protesters should remove himself, because that was the Jews' fault. It wasn't the Jews' fault. The protesters had a duty to restrain themselves, and the police should have required that of them, and didn't.
Yeah, yeah. So my question again is, does this show, the instance that you quoted, the incident that I quoted, does this show that there's a lack of self-confidence within the British political and legal culture these days?
I think that is right, and certainly a lack of liberal conviction that certain principles have to be upheld. And in this case, I suspect that the police's main concern is just to avoid trouble on the streets. And they may have worried that they would have difficulty containing a protest that got really upset. But that's what they're there for. And I think they need, whether we're talking about the police or university vice-chancellors or newspaper editors, whereas in 10 years ago we could all take for granted we are liberal societies, we can't do that anymore because of the threats to liberal free speech. And therefore, leaders of institutions and bodies like the police need to be far more self-conscious about affirming the right to free speech.
Right, but how exactly do you do this? I mean, there are high sensitivities, obviously, with many members of the Muslim community here in Britain who feel very strongly about their religion being insulted. Now, at the other hand, you don't want to appear chauvinistic or reactionary when you insist on free speech principles. So what would be the right, political language to convey this message?
I don't know exactly, Joachim, but in terms of, yes, I mean, Muslims feel many Muslims feel very sensitive about what they perceive to be the insult to their religion. I'm a practicing Christian, Joachim. I have to live in a society where my religion is regularly mocked and parodied. If I were of a sensitive nature, it would upset me enormously. But I have to live in a society and tolerate that, and that's part of what's required of living in a liberal society. And although it might be difficult to persuade certain excitable Muslims to learn that, it's part of living in a liberal society. They have to learn it because we can't make the deeply felt passions and grievances of people, as it were, the measure of the extent of free speech. Otherwise we lose it. Because lots of people can get very upset. We can all get upset. That cannot be what draws the boundaries of free speech.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nigel, one last question, if I may. On the way to here, I passed by a monument in central London that I hadn't seen before, to be honest. It's on Constitution Hill, and several columns commemorating the 5 million volunteers from the Commonwealth nations who fought alongside the British forces in the First and in the Second World War. And apparently, I mean, 5 million volunteers from the colonies, from the empire, that's quite enough. Yeah. And an inscription there says, and I found this very beautiful, "Our future is greater than our past." Do you think this is true?
Depends on what it means. I certainly think that in terms of race relations, we in Britain are in a much better place than we were 50 years ago, and even during the Empire. So I rejoice in the fact that we have recently had an ethnically Indian Hindu Prime Minister. I rejoice in the fact that we now have a first-generation black Nigerian woman as leader of the Conservative opposition. In some ways, that is a realization of the liberal ideal of the Empire. So in that respect, I think, and I rejoice in the fact that we now remember that Britain's fight against the Nazis and the fascists was not just a white British thing, it was an imperial thing. My own father fought in Italy, and he was at one point mistaken for an Indian because he'd become so brown because of the sunshine by some GIs, because across the hills was an Indian division fighting in Italy. Mm-hmm. And I rejoice, and someone has pointed out that actually the British war effort was a widely imperial effort. People of all skin colours, from South Africa to the West Indies to India to China to Zionists from Israel involved. And I rejoice in that. And so Britain's relatively happy multicultural state, multiracial state now is a fulfillment of that. So yes, in that respect, our present is better than our past, and I hope our future will continue to be better than our present.
Lord Biggar, thank you so much.
My pleasure too. Thank you.